August 25th, 1944. Cherbourg, France. The pre-dawn darkness over the port of Cherbourg hung thick with diesel fumes and the sharp metallic scent of ocean spray. At 0430 hours, Corporal James Bazemore stood beside his 2.5-ton GMC truck, what the men called a Jimmy, watching the first pale threads of morning light creep across the Cotentin Peninsula. He was 19 years old, from Baltimore, and 3 months ago, he'd been loading ammunition crates in a depot 70 miles behind the Normandy beaches. He'd never driven a truck in combat before yesterday. Nobody had asked if he knew how. Behind him, stretching into the gloom like an iron serpent, 47 more trucks idled in formation. Their engines created a rumble that seemed to shake the very cobblestones beneath Bazemore's boots. Each truck wore a fresh coat of olive drab paint, and on their hoods and canvas sides, someone had stenciled a simple marking in bright red, a red circle, like a bullseye, like a target. The red ball, priority cargo, express delivery, no stops, no dilas. Bazemore's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, not from fear exactly, though fear was certainly present, but from the weight of understanding what those red circles meant. The entire Allied advance across France depended on what he and 22,000 other soldiers, most of them young, most of them black, most of them invisible to the history being written in real time, would accomplish in the next 83 days. The French roads between Cherbourg and the German border had existed for centuries. Roman legions had marched along their predecessors. Medieval merchants had transported wool and wine along their lengths. Farmers had driven cattle to market on these same routes for generations. The roads were narrow, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass, with surfaces of compacted stone and dirt that turned to soup in the rain. They wound through hedgerow country, past stone farmhouses with slate roofs, under canopies of ancient oak trees whose branches met overhead like cathedral arches. For 800 years, these had been civilian roads, commerce roads, the arteries of ordinary French life. On this morning in August 1944, they became something else entirely. They became weapons of war. The crisis nobody saw coming. To understand why these roads mattered, you have to understand the situation facing Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower in late August 1944. The Normandy invasion on June 6 had succeeded beyond anyone's most optimistic predictions in establishing a beachhead, but for 2 brutal months, American, British, and Canadian forces had been trapped in a killing ground of hedgerows and fortified villages, gaining ground measured in yards, not miles. The ancient bocage country of Normandy, with its centuries-old earthen walls topped with dense hedges, had become a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. Then, on July 25th, everything changed. Operation Cobra, a massive American offensive supported by carpet bombing that dropped over 3,000 tons of explosives on German positions, finally shattered the enemy's defensive line. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's First Army punched through. 3 days later, General George S. Patton's Third Army poured through the gap like water, bursting through a cracked dam. By August, Allied forces were racing across France at speeds that made military planners dizzy. Patton's tanks were covering 75 miles in a single day. Towns that intelligence had estimated would take weeks to capture were falling in hours. Paris would be liberated by August 25th. The German army was in full retreat. Victory seemed within reach, maybe by Christmas. The war might actually end in 1944. But there was a problem, and it was the kind of problem that wins or loses wars long before the first shot is fired. Logistics. Every division required 750 tons of supplies every single day. 28 Allied divisions were now spread across France, advancing so fast they were outrunning their supply lines. That meant 21,000 tons of supplies needed daily. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, and most critically, gasoline. Patton's Third Army alone consumed 400,000 gallons of fuel every 24 hours. His tanks couldn't fight without it. His trucks couldn't move without it. His entire army would grind to a halt without it. And there was no way to deliver it. The French railway system, which should have been the primary supply artery, lay in ruins. Allied bombers had spent months before D-Day systematically destroying every rail bridge, every marshalling yard, every locomotive depot in northern France to prevent Germany from rushing reinforcements to Normandy. The plan had worked brilliantly for the invasion. Now it was strangling the Allied advance. The rails that remained intact used different gauges than British and American rolling stock. Repair crews were working around the clock, but it would be months before the railroads could carry significant cargo. The deep water ports that could handle the massive cargo ships arriving from America, Calais, Le Havre, Brest, were still in German hands or so heavily damaged they were unusable. Only Cherbourg was operational, and even there, the Germans had sabotaged the harbor so thoroughly before surrendering that it was functioning at barely 30% capacity. Every gallon of gasoline, every shell, every can of rations had to be offloaded at Cherbourg for 100 miles from where the fighting was happening. For 100 miles of narrow French country roads. That was the only supply line connecting the most powerful mechanized army in human history to its source of fuel and ammunition. Lieutenant Colonel Laurent Ayres, a logistics officer with a reputation for solving impossible problems, stood in a command tent outside Cherbourg on the night of August 23rd, staring at a map of France with growing horror. His superiors had given him 36 hours to figure out how to move 12,500 tons of supplies every day across 400 miles of inadequate roads to supply points that were moving farther east every hour. 36 hours to organize the largest trucking operation in military history. Ayres was a compact man with sharp eyes and an aggressive reputation that had earned him the nickname Little Patton. He'd spent the previous month scrounging for trucks, pulling vehicles from artillery units, anti-aircraft batteries, anywhere he could find them. He'd located 5,958 trucks, most of them the reliable GMC 2.5-ton cargo trucks the men called Jimmies. He'd also found 132 truck companies, complete transportation units that could be reorganized into a coordinated convoy system. But trucks without drivers were useless, and the Army didn't have 23,000 trained truck drivers sitting around waiting for assignment. So Ayres did what logistics officers do in desperate times. He improvised. He sent orders to every unit in the European theater. Any soldier whose duties were not absolutely critical to immediate combat operations would be reassigned as a driver. Infantry, riflemen waiting in reserve. Artillery, crew members between bombardments. Maintenance personnel. Cooks, clerks. Anyone who could walk could be taught to drive a truck. They get a couple hours of instruction, maybe a day if they were lucky, and then they'd be on the road carrying ammunition and gasoline through a war zone. Most of these reassigned soldiers were African American. This wasn't an accident. The United States Army in 1944 was segregated by law and by practice. Military leadership, reflecting the racism of American society, believed that black soldiers lacked the intelligence and courage for combat roles. Despite African Americans making up roughly 10% of the Army, they comprised over 20% of service and supply units. They worked as stevedores in the ports, unloading ships. They served as mechanics, keeping vehicles running. They drove trucks, hauled equipment, built roads, dug latrines, anything that white officers considered safe rear echelon work. The irony was savage. Black soldiers were considered unfit for combat, yet they were about to be sent on a mission that would require them to drive through contested territory, past German stragglers, under threat of air attack, for 54 hours straight without adequate rest, carrying the most explosive and flammable cargo imaginable. They would do this not once, but repeatedly, every day, for 3 months. And if they failed, the war would stall. Maybe for months. Maybe forever. The first morning, James Bazemore climbed into his truck at 500 hours. His co-driver, a quiet kid from Georgia named Roosevelt Jackson, slid into the passenger seat. They'd met 2 days ago. Neither of them had driven anything larger than a delivery van before the war. Now they were responsible for a vehicle loaded with 150 jerry cans of gasoline, 5 tons of the most explosive liquid on Earth, heading into a combat zone on roads that might have German soldiers hiding in the ditches. The jerry can, a German innovation that the Allies had copied and improved, was a brilliant piece of engineering. A flat-sided metal container that held 5 gallons of fuel, designed to stack efficiently and pour without spilling. Each truck carried 30 of them, strapped down in the bed. Do the math. 1,500 gallons of gasoline. One tracer round, one spark, one moment of carelessness, and the entire truck would become a fireball visible for miles. Bazemore tried not to think about it as he started the engine and felt the Jimmy rumble to life beneath him. The truck had been manufactured in a General Motors plant in Michigan, probably built by workers who'd never seen combat, people who went home to their families every night and listened to the war on the radio like it was a baseball game. Now this truck, and thousands like it, would determine whether democracy or fascism controlled Europe. At 0530, the convoy began to move. 48 trucks, escorted by 2 jeeps carrying military police with mounted machine guns. They rolled through the shattered streets of Cherbourg, past buildings reduced to skeletal frameworks by months of bombing, past French civilians who emerged from cellars to watch with expressions Bazemore couldn't quite read. Gratitude? Fear? Exhaustion? Probably all three. The northern route out of Cherbourg had been designated as the supply road. The southern route would be for empty trucks returning. One-way traffic, military only. Signs had been posted every 100 yards, red circles on white backgrounds with stark letters in English and French. Red Ball Highway. Military traffic only. Violators will be prosecuted. Of course, nobody followed the signs. By 0700, as the convoy reached the outskirts of Alagnes, Bazemore had already encountered 3 French civilian vehicles on the road, farmers trying to move produce to market, unaware or uncaring that they were blocking a military supply line. One of the MP jeeps had to physically push a horse cart off the road, while the farmer shouted curses in rapid French that Bazemore didn't understand, but whose meaning was crystal clear. The roads themselves were worse than anyone had described. Narrow, barely 15 feet wide in places, with surfaces that had been designed for foot traffic and light wagons, not for 6-ton trucks carrying 5-ton loads. The trucks had to maintain 60-yard intervals, officially, to avoid presenting a concentrated target for German aircraft. In practice, the intervals collapsed constantly as drivers tried to navigate around potholes, bomb craters, and the debris of battle. Dead German vehicles still littered the roadsides, pushed aside by engineers but not removed. The smell of decomposition hung in the summer heat. Bazemore drove with his hands welded to the steering wheel, his eyes scanning constantly. The hedgerows on either side created a tunnel effect, dense walls of ancient vegetation that could hide anything. A German machine gun team. A sniper. An ambush. Intel said the area was secure, but Intel also said the roads would be clear, and that hadn't been true. Roosevelt Jackson sat in silence, occasionally checking the side mirror, occasionally glancing at the map on his lap that was supposed to guide them to the forward supply dump outside Chartres. Neither man spoke much. What was there to say? They were 19 and 20 years old, driving a bomb through a war zone, and if they made one mistake, they'd never see 21. At 0900, they passed through Corentin. The town had been the scene of fierce fighting in June. Now it was quiet, occupied by American military police who waved the convoy through without stopping. Bazemore caught a glimpse of a white family eating breakfast in a cafe, looking impossibly normal, as if the war were something happening somewhere else to someone else. Maybe that's how you survived, he thought, by pretending. By noon, they'd covered 70 miles. The convoy stopped at a regulating station, a hastily erected checkpoint where military police recorded each truck's cargo, destination, and departure time. Drivers were supposed to rest here, switch positions, check their vehicles. Bazemore and Jackson had 15 minutes. They used the time to eat K-rations and stare at the road ahead. Behind them, more convoys were already arriving. Ahead, the route stretched east toward Paris, toward the sound of distant artillery that never quite stopped. The weight of contradiction. What made the Red Ball Express truly remarkable and truly tragic wasn't just its scale or its urgency. It was the profound contradiction at its heart. These men, 75% of whom were African American, were literally keeping democracy alive. Without them, Patton's tanks would run dry. Without them, Bradley's infantry would run out of ammunition. Without them, the Allied advance would collapse, the Germans would dig in, and the war that might have ended in 1944 would drag on into 1945, 1946, maybe longer. These drivers were as essential to victory as any general, any fighter pilot, any infantry assault. And yet they couldn't vote in much of their own country. They couldn't eat in the same restaurants as white soldiers. They couldn't drink from the same water fountains. When they returned home, assuming they survived, they'd go back to Jim Crow laws and segregation and the daily humiliations that America reserved for black citizens. Private Austin Powlese of the 3,902nd Quartermaster Company wrote in a letter home, "We haul the gas that moves the tanks. We haul the shells that kill the Germans. And the white officers who give us orders won't shake our hands." Figure that one out. The French, ironically, treated them better than their own army did. French civilians, grateful for liberation, welcomed American soldiers without regard to race. French women dated black soldiers. French shopkeepers served them without hesitation. This created tensions that military command tried desperately to suppress. White soldiers, particularly those from the South, complained that the French were spoiling black troops by treating them like human beings. Some white units tried to maintain segregation by telling French civilians that black soldiers at tails were subhuman, shouldn't be trusted. The French, who had just lived through 4 years of Nazi occupation, found American racism baffling and offensive. More than one French resistance fighter, upon learning about segregation in the American military, asked in genuine confusion why the Allies were fighting fascism abroad while practicing it at home. There were no good answers to that question. On the roads, the contradictions played out in real time. African-American truck companies would be overtaking slower white convoys, and the white drivers would deliberately swerve into the center of the road to block them. A game of chicken at 40 miles per hour, loaded trucks carrying explosives, all because some white drivers couldn't tolerate the thought of black drivers passing them. Military police try to keep the races separated during off-duty hours. You accepted discrimination. Washington rector of the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company recalled decades later. "We were warned not to fraternize with whites for fear problems would arise." But on the road, survival mattered more than racism. When a truck broke down, when a convoy was under fire, when drivers needed help, the color of skin mattered less than getting the job done. White and black soldiers worked side by side in those moments, united by necessity, if not by conviction. And some white soldiers saw the truth clearly. An armored division commander, watching black drivers deliver gasoline under German artillery fire, told a reporter, "Damned if I'd want their job. They have what it takes." A tank driver with the 5th Armored Division said, "If it wasn't for the red ball, we couldn't have moved." They all were black drivers, and they delivered in the heat of combat. We'd be in our tanks praying for them to come up. Those prayers were necessary. The Red Ball Express was supposed to be a safe rear echelon operation, but the reality of fast-moving warfare meant there was no such thing as a safe rear. The front lines were fluid. German units bypassed by the advance would set up ambushes. Snipers hid in the forests. Luftwaffe aircraft, though increasingly rare by late 1944, still occasionally strafe convoys. Powlese remembered, "We drive and be fired upon at the same time." It's still ringing in my ears. Sergeant Levada Hall, one of the 23,000 drivers, described delivering supplies under constant small arms fire, navigating mine-damaged roads, watching trucks ahead explode, and having no choice but to keep driving because the frontline troops needed what he carried more than he needed to feel safe. The official casualty figures for Red Ball drivers were never properly compiled. The Army didn't keep detailed records of losses in service units the way it did for combat units. But drivers died. They died in accidents when exhaustion caused them to drive off roads. They died when overloaded trucks rolled over on curves. They died when German fighters strafed convoys. They died when they stepped on mines while checking damaged roads. And when they died, their names rarely appeared in newspapers back home. No medals were awarded for driving a truck, even if you drove it through hell. The system that shouldn't have worked. The Red Ball Express should have failed. Everything about it violated basic logistics principles. The trucks were overloaded, officially rated for 5 tons, but regularly carrying 7 or 8. This destroyed suspensions, burned out transmissions, and made the vehicles nearly impossible to control on winding roads. The drivers were undertrained. Some had literally never driven a truck before being assigned to a Red Ball company. They learned on the job, which meant learning while carrying explosives through a war zone. The roads were inadequate, too narrow, too damaged, too poorly maintained for the volume of traffic being forced through them. The distances were too great. A round trip from Cherbourg to Chartres, the initial destination, covered 350 miles. As the front moved east, the distance increased to 400 miles, then 500, then more. A single trip took 54 hours of continuous driving, with minimal rest stops. Drivers were supposed to work in 2-man teams, switching off, but exhaustion was constant. The maintenance situation was catastrophic. These trucks were running 24 hours a day in conditions that would destroy civilian vehicles in weeks. Tires wore out. Engines overheated. Transmissions failed. Brakes, caked with dried mud from French roads, would seize up or fail completely. Broken trucks were supposed to be towed to repair depots, but there weren't enough wreckers or mechanics. So broken trucks were simply pushed off the road, gutted for parts if they were salvageable, and left as roadside monuments to the operation's brutal pace. The weather didn't cooperate. August and September in northern France can be hot and dry, or it can rain for days. The Red Ball got both. Heat caused engines to overheat, drivers to collapse from exhaustion, fuel to expand in the jerry cans until they leaked. Rain turned the unpaved sections of road into swamps. Those 11-inch wheels, standard on military trucks, would sink into mud and spin helplessly. Drivers would burn out clutches trying to get unstuck. Sometimes entire convoys would bog down, creating traffic jams that lasted hours. And yet it worked. By August 29th, just 4 days after the operation began, the Red Ball Express hit its peak performance. 132 truck companies, 5,958 vehicles, carrying 12,342 tons of supplies in a single day. This record would never be broken during the operation's 83-day existence. The tonnage would fluctuate, dropping to an average of 5,088 tons per day by October, then 2,711 tons in late October as French railroads came back online and reduced the need for long-haul trucking. But for 3 crucial months, when the Allied advance could have stalled, when fuel shortages could have given Germany time to reorganize its defenses, when the momentum that might end the war could have been lost, the Red Ball Express kept rolling. Over 412,193 tons of supplies delivered. Over 6,000 trucks making the round trip again and again. 23,000 drivers who worked until they literally fell asleep at the wheel and had to be awakened by their co-drivers. How did it work? Largely because the men driving those trucks refused to let it fail. They ignored regulations when regulations didn't make sense. The official speed limit was 25 miles per hour. The official spacing was 60 yards between vehicles. In reality, drivers removed the governor devices that limited their engines, racing at 50, 60, even 70 miles per hour on open stretches of road. They closed up the intervals to 10 or 15 yards, creating convoys that stretched for miles, so tightly packed that if one truck stopped, 20 behind it would have to brake. These violations were dangerous, technically punishable by court-martial, and absolutely necessary if the supplies were going to reach the front in time to matter. They drove through blackout conditions, navigating at night with only tiny cat-eye blackout lights that were barely visible, avoiding enemy detection but making it nearly impossible to see the road. They developed informal systems that official channels couldn't accommodate. If a truck broke down, The driver would flag down the next convoy and hitch a ride to the nearest regulating station, where he'd report the breakdown. Then he'd grab whatever truck was available and get back on the road, because sitting idle while your truck was being repaired was unacceptable when men were dying at the front because they'd run out of ammunition. They took care of each other in ways the Army manual didn't describe. If an African-American driver found himself stranded in a town where the white military police were less than helpful, other black drivers would make detours to pick him up. If a white driver was stuck, black drivers would help him too, not out of any sense of racial harmony, but because abandoning another driver violated the code that had developed among men who shared the same dangerous job. And they took immense pride in what they were doing. These were men who'd been told their entire lives that they weren't good enough, weren't smart enough, weren't brave enough. Now they were being told by generals that the entire Allied advance depended on them. General Eisenhower visited Red Ball units and personally thanked drivers. General Patton, who had complicated feelings about race but uncomplicated feelings about military necessity, called the truck our most valuable weapon. Time magazine ran an article calling the Red Ball the miracle of supply. War correspondents wrote stories about the drivers who were making victory possible. For 3 months, these invisible men became visible. For 3 months, they were heroes. And then it ended. The roads return home. November 16, 1944. The Red Ball Express officially ceased operations. It hadn't failed. It had succeeded so thoroughly that it was no longer needed. The port of Antwerp in Belgium had finally been captured and made operational, providing a deep-water harbor much closer to the front lines. French and Belgian railroads had been substantially repaired, allowing trains to carry bulk cargo more efficiently than trucks. Portable gasoline pipelines, a technological innovation that would transform military logistics, were being laid across France, delivering fuel directly from ports to forward depots without requiring trucks at all. The roads between Cherbourg and Chartres, between Corentin and Paris, between all those towns whose names had become familiar to drivers who'd driven them dozens of times, those roads were officially reopened to civilian traffic. Farmers could move their produce again. French families could travel to visit relatives. The roads stopped being weapons and went back to being roads. Most of the 23,000 drivers were reassigned to other trucking operations with different names: the White Ball Express, the Green Diamond Express, the ABC Express. Some were sent to drive in Germany as the Allied armies crossed the Rhine and pushed into the heart of the Third Reich. A few, very few, were allowed to transfer to combat units, though this required special permission from commanders who still believed black soldiers couldn't fight. James Bazemore would survive the war and return to Baltimore, where he worked as a city truck driver until his retirement in 1986. When asked about the Red Ball Express in a 1997 interview, he said, "We didn't think about what we were doing much because it was our job. We carried gas, all kinds of supplies, and even hauled bodies back to take to the cemetery." That last detail, hauling bodies, doesn't appear in most official histories, but it was part of the job. The same trucks that carried ammunition forward carried dead soldiers back. The same drivers who'd risked their lives to keep the living supplied also transported the dead to military cemeteries. The Red Ball Express carried the entire weight of war, both its momentum and its cost. Austin Powys returned to civilian life, but never stopped thinking about the roads of France. Decades later, he still remembered the sound of bullets striking metal, the smell of diesel and cordite, the exhaustion so profound that sleep became a desperate hunger. "It's still ringing in my ears," he said. The roads themselves still exist. You could drive them today. They're wider now, paved with modern materials, marked with road signs that mention nothing about red balls or express convoys. Tour buses take visitors to Normandy to see the beaches and the cemeteries and the museums dedicated to D-Day. Most tourists never think about the roads they're driving on, never realize that the same pavement that carries them in air-conditioned comfort once carried desperate young men in overloaded trucks racing against time and death to keep an army moving. There are no monuments to the Red Ball Express along those roads. No plaques commemorating the 412,000 193 tons of supplies delivered. No markers noting that this particular stretch of highway was where Corporal Johnson from the 3717th Quartermaster Company drove his truck off the road from Exhaustion and died in a ditch at 22 years old. No signs indicating that here, at this intersection, African-American drivers were blocked by racist white drivers playing games with loaded explosives because their pride mattered more than mission. The roads remember nothing. That's what roads do. They serve whoever's using them and then forget. What we carry forward. The story of the Red Ball Express teaches us something fundamental about war and about humanity. Victory requires more than courage on the battlefield. It requires the unglamorous, exhausting, dangerous work of keeping armies supplied. It requires logistics, that dull word that means the difference between winning and losing. As the old saying goes, amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. But it teaches us something else too. It teaches us that we have a remarkable capacity to demand that people sacrifice everything for a cause while simultaneously denying them the basic dignity they're fighting to preserve. The men who drove the Red Ball Express were told that democracy was worth dying for while being denied their democratic rights. They were told that all men are created equal while being treated as decidedly unequal. They were told they were heroes while being segregated from the people they were heroically serving. This contradiction didn't escape the men living it. They understood exactly what was being asked of them and exactly what they weren't being given in return. And most of them chose to serve anyway, not because they accepted the system, but because they hoped their service might change it. In some ways, it did. The performance of black soldiers in World War II, in the Red Ball Express, and in the combat units that finally allowed them to fight, in the Tuskegee Airmen and the 761st Tank Battalion, and countless other units, helped create the pressure that would eventually desegregate the military in 1948. It contributed to the civil rights movement that would challenge segregation across American society in the 1950s and 1960s. In other ways, it didn't. Racism didn't end because black soldiers proved their worth in war. Many white veterans returned home and continued believing that racial segregation was natural and necessary. Progress came slowly, painfully, through continued struggle. The roads of France became weapons in 1944 because an army in desperate need of supplies transformed civilian infrastructure into a military asset. But roads are just roads. They go where people direct them. They carry what people load onto them. They become what circumstances demand. The same is true of people. We become what circumstances demand of us, for better or worse. The drivers of the Red Ball Express were ordinary men from ordinary backgrounds. They've been farmhands and factory workers and store clerks. The war didn't make them heroes. It gave them a chance to demonstrate the heroism that had been there all along, invisible, waiting for circumstances that required it to emerge. That's the lesson worth remembering. Not just that logistics matter, though they do. Not just that racism is a betrayal of the values we claim to hold, though it is. But that ordinary people, given impossible tasks and insufficient resources and every reason to fail, can accomplish extraordinary things if they choose not to quit. The Red Ball Express kept rolling because the men driving those trucks refused to let it stop. They drove when they were exhausted. They drove when they were scared. They drove when they were being shot at. They drove because soldiers at the front were depending on them. And that dependence created an obligation more powerful than fear or exhaustion or the knowledge that their own country didn't value them the way it should. They kept rolling. That's the story. That's what the roads remember, even if the roads themselves have forgotten. We want to thank you for listening to this story from World War II. These accounts of real people facing impossible situations and finding the strength to continue. These are the stories that need to be told and retold. If this resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment telling us where you're listening from and what other stories from the war you'd like to hear. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these forgotten histories to light. The men who drove the Red Ball Express didn't ask for recognition. They just did their jobs, but their jobs changed the course of history. The least we can do is remember their names and tell their stories. Thank you for helping us do that.